All right, folks. We are back to take a look at those first 10 amendments to the Constitution of the United States. We talked about how our Constitution has 27 amendments, but 10 of those are going to come preloaded. And so this is part of the adoption process for the Constitution. So let's look at how that worked first, right? Or if you remember, the Constitutional Convention in 1787, and there is a great deal of debate about whether or not to adopt this Constitution, what this Constitution is going to mean, and one of the big debates centers around this idea of, is there going to be a list of rights that people um, have, right? Is there going to be protection for individual freedoms? Thomas Jefferson was one of the first to kind of look at this and say, I really think this needs to be part of any constitution. On the flip side, Alexander Hamilton is going to disagree. Now, that doesn't mean Alexander Hamilton didn't want individual freedoms. It's a difference in the way they were looking at things. Thomas Jefferson said, we need a list of freedoms in here um, to ensure that the government's not trampling over the people. Alexander Hamilton was worried because he said, hey, if we make a list, what happens if we leave something really important off of that list? Does that mean that the people don't have that power? And he wasn't wild about making that list because he didn't know if he could get everything. Thomas Jefferson's on the other side going, you don't have to list everything. Let's just have a list of the big ones and then reserve those freedoms for the people in some other things that we're going to write. In order to get important states like Virginia to adopt the Constitution, they agreed to add a Bill of Rights. And so the Bill of Rights is going to be the brainchild of a guy named James Madison. James Madison will go on to be a president of the United States and had a big hand in the writing of the Constitution. And basically, these are going to be these rights that we're going to see are civil liberties, and they are going to be greatly influenced by the experiences of these people with the rule of the British. So everything is kind of going to go back and say, well, hey, we didn't like this about um, what used to happen when Britain was in charge. We want to make sure that we have the right to to certain things. And so a lot of these are going to be in response to what the British are going to see. So you're going to be familiar with these. Probably the First Amendment you're very familiar with. There are five really important freedoms that are included in the First Amendment. The First Amendment says that we will not have an established religion in the United States. In England, they had the Church of England, which was the official church. But we know from history that a lot of the people coming to the colonies were doing it for religious freedom. And so basically, our Constitution says we're not going to have a national religion here in the United States. And we're going to let people within reason practice whatever religion they want to practice. We're not going to interfere with that in any way. You have a freedom of speech. Now, your freedom of speech, a lot of people think, well, that means I can say whatever I want. It doesn't mean that at all. Basically, it's a freedom of political speech. So if you're speaking out against the government can't throw you in jail or something like that for doing that. We're going to look at some instances, especially when we get to the Supreme Court section at the end of our time together, where people have tried to use free speech. There's a famous case where somebody yelled fire in a crowded movie theater. People got hurt, dude gets arrested. And basically, the lesson is you don't have a right to be an idiot. You can't say whatever you want if it's going to endanger people. This is meant to preserve political speech. Freedom of the press. We don't have a state-controlled press like they do in places like China. We have an independent media, and the idea is that they're keeping an eye on everybody. And you see a lot of that today where people don't seem to like that a whole lot. Politicians will rail against the media and yell fake news or but basically as you kind of dig into some of that stuff, what you see is um, maybe they don't like the slant of the coverage or the way something's being taken. But I think you could make a pretty convincing argument that a free press is necessary to kind of keep an eye on the folks who are running the government. Right to assembly, and so this is the right to come together to protest for certain things. We've certainly seen a lot of that in the summer of 2020, being out there. But basically, hey, you got a right to get together and say, hey, we don't like this very much. Usually, you have to get a permit to do something like that. Not always, but to get a permit and things to do that. But you have to have your right to do that, and even let people assemble that you may not agree with. I remember being a kid, and every couple of years, the Klan would come down and have rallies around the square in town. And obviously, a lot of people don't agree with what that group stands for, but in our system of government, they have a right to assemble and to be there as well, and then a right to petition the government. And kind of a cool way the Obama White House started this one out with the internet. There is a petition website there on the White House site, or was back in the day, where you could put a petition up there, and if it got enough signatures, then they said they would give a response from the president. I remember when this happened, and people were kind of wondering if this was true or not. And so one of the petitions that they signed was to have the U.S. government build a Death Star. If you've seen Star Wars, right? You know what the Death Star is. Build their own Death Star, and it got millions of signatures. I may or may not have been one of them. And President Obama had to come out at a press conference and talk about why it didn't make a whole lot of sense for us to try and build a Death Star. But he had somebody figure out how much money the Death Star would be in that sort of deal. But just kind of a fun little way of doing that. A lot of times you'll see that with cases for people who've been wrongfully imprisoned or things like that, is a way to do that. But there's a whole lot of important stuff right there in that First Amendment. And that's just the very first one to the Constitution. Second Amendment. This one's one that can get you in a heated argument almost at the drop of a hat, right? The Second Amendment says that in order to maintain a well-armed militia, the right of the people to bear arms shall not be infringed upon. And so basically the idea is you have a right to own a gun. Now, that's one, like I said, there are some people, I'm sure within the sound of my voice, that say, yes, that is the most important one of these rights that we have. They can have my gun when they pry it from my cold, dead hands, right? There are other people that look and say, hey, not real wild about gun stuff. People do bad things with guns. For the most part, kind of the interesting thing is if you look at the American people, most people say, yeah, you ought to be able to have a gun, but there should be rules about who can have them, what kind of guns you can have. And most of the majority of Americans will say, yeah, there needs to be kind of some common sense rules, but it's a kind of a political nightmare talking about guns. You'll see this a lot of times when there are mass shooting incidents in the country. Usually people get really fired up, and then they start talking about wanting to do something about the Second Amendment. Then Third Amendment talks about quartering troops. Basically, this is another one of those that's in direct response to some stuff Britain had done before. Basically, this meant that you didn't have to put up soldiers in your home. So, a British soldier back pre-revolution could, you could be required to take that person in your home, give them a place to sleep, give them food, that sort of thing. They come in and put their muddy boots up on your coffee table, eat all your good food, drink all your good drink, and there wasn't anything you could do about it. And so the Third Amendment says we're not going to require the quartering of troops by the American people. That's one, you obviously don't hear a whole lot about today. It's not something that's super important to us in 2020. Hopefully it doesn't have to become super important to us in 2020. But again, something you see uh, kind of pointing back to a time pre-Revolutionary War. Fourth Amendment, several things that are going on in the Fourth Amendment. This is going to be really important to you if you plan on being a criminal later on in life. Listen up to this one, right? So your Fourth Amendment protects you from illegal search and seizure, right? A lot of times we hear the term probable cause. So if somebody pulls you over, right, a policeman pulls you over for speeding, they can't say, "I want you to open your trunk and show me what's in your trunk," right? Unless they hear somebody pounding on the lid of the trunk saying, "Let me out, this guy's nuts," right? That's probable cause, right? They could look back then. But basically, the idea was what would happen a lot of times in England is political enemies, right? They'd plant evidence, or they would just go search somebody's house, knowing that if they searched hard enough, they could probably find something that was against the law that was going on in that house. And so the American people said, we don't want that, right? We want a right to privacy. If you're going to come in and you're going to investigate, or if you're going to tap our phones, or if you're going to do those sorts of things, you need to have a judge say, yes, there's a reason for you to do this. A lot of times, you like cop shows and things like that on television, you'll see them going and getting warrants for things, and that comes from this Fourth Amendment, right? This idea that we want to really have our privacy, and so this is to preserve that. Anytime you hear about a right to privacy in the Constitution, there is nothing that says you have a right to privacy, but people will point towards the Fourth Amendment and say, "Yeah, um, this is what people are talking about." The Fifth Amendment talks about what happens if you get accused of a crime, right? So let's say they found probable cause. Fourth Amendment didn't work. You've got the Fifth Amendment, right? Fifth Amendment protects you against having to testify against yourself. If you've ever heard somebody say, "I plead the Fifth," right? Basically, that means I'm not going to answer questions about this because it could um, mean that I'm going to be convicted of a crime, right? So if they're going to convict you of a crime, they've got to convict you without you having to testify against yourself. If you're married, there are also protections against your spouse having to testify against you, right? Because if you're under oath and you're saying, "Hey, I promise to tell the truth," and then somebody says, "Hey, that guy that was in your trunk, did you really put him in there?" You can incriminate yourself, right? And so this protects you against that. It also protects you against what's called double jeopardy. You can't be tried twice for the same crime. And so back when I was your age, a little bit younger, there was this guy named O.J. Simpson who was a famous football player. He'd gone on to be an actor, and he gets accused of killing his wife and his ex-wife and her boyfriend. And so they go through this whole trial. It was months and months that they went through this process, and he's found innocent. He's acquitted of the crime. Um, so you can't go back and try him for that crime again. Dude even went and wrote a book called "If I Did It," where he basically admitted, "This is the way I killed him." Now they didn't let him release the book, but but he could even say it. But he's been found not guilty, so you can't go be tried twice. In the film library, I've got a copy of this movie called Double Jeopardy. It's a good one to illustrate this. Ashley Judd, her husband, frames her for his murder, and so she goes to prison. He runs off, and then when she gets out of prison, she goes to find him. And so it's kind of a good one. You gotta love some Tommy Lee Jones too. He's in that one. The Sixth Amendment says you have a right to a speedy trial. Now, definition of a speedy trial could be different. Our legal system is pretty packed today, and so it'd probably be slower than what we would want. But you have a right to a speedy trial. They can't just keep you in jail for um, for a long time without telling you what the charges are against you, and they have to be moving along in the legal process if you're going to be charged for something. This also gives you a right to counsel. That right's going to be expanded later on with some court cases that we're going to see from the 1960s. But this is just ensuring you've got a right to a trial. That trial also, according to the Seventh Amendment, has to happen from a trial of your peers, right? So you have a right to a trial by jury. Now, a lot of times in England, um, you've got a judge or a panel of judges that's deciding things. This is saying no. We want the people to be the jury in this case. And so I've been called before for jury duty. You guys that are turning 18, um, one of the things that'll happen um, the first of the new year, they will print out the jury pool for the next year, and so you'll read in the paper, right? Did your name get picked? And then over the course of the year, if they need a jury, they can call you in for jury duty. And it's one of the things that is kind of essential for the American experiment, right? If we're going to have trials by jury, then every once in a while we all have to take our turn being on those juries. But basically, the idea is your fate's not going to be decided by one person who might be really biased, right? Judges in England had a reputation among the colonists as being really corrupt. You're going to face 12 members of basically your community, right, who are going to sit there and say yes or no as far as your guilt or innocence is concerned. The Eighth Amendment protects you against a couple of things. One is excessive bail. So uh, basically, it's all about punishments. They can't put a punishment on you that's too harsh for the crime, and so they're not allowed to impose a huge bail on you to keep you from getting out of jail before your trial. They also can't punish you with what they call cruel and unusual punishment. And one of the things we're going to see as we go through is this definition of cruel and unusual punishment has changed over the years. At different times in our history, it has outlawed the death penalty in this country. It has outlawed certain types of capital punishment, so the electric chair, things like that, have been said no, that's cruel and unusual. Um, but different times, federally and at the state level, there have been people that said no, the death penalty is cruel, or killing somebody this particular way is cruel. But the idea was you want to keep them away from um, just horrible punishments. In England, again, connecting back, there were these things called star chambers where they would bring people in and basically torture them for crimes they committed. We said we don't want that, right? We want the punishment to fit the crime, but it couldn't be cruel or unusual. The Ninth Amendment, and I put the words here for you because it's a little hard to get, but it says the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. So this is basically answering that concern that Alexander Hamilton had, right? Basically, it says just because the enumeration, just because we listed them here in the Bill of Rights, that doesn't mean that they don't have other rights that aren't written down here, right? So the Ninth Amendment kind of answers that question and says, look, just because we got this list and we've got these rights that have come before, that doesn't mean that it's an exhaustive list, right? There are other things, right? We just kind of wrote down some ones that seemed really important to us right now, um, but keep in mind this isn't a complete list. And then the 10th Amendment basically says the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Basically meant that any kind of power not listed in the Constitution is reserved for state and local government. The founding fathers understood, I think, that um, the government is going to be best if it's closest to the people. And keep in mind, this is a long time ago. This is before ease of travel and communication and things like that. It said basically the government that's right in somebody's town or in their county um, needs to have the power to rule on a lot of these things, right? The federal government's got to have some powers. We've tried a real good job in the Constitution to lay them out here. But anything that's not designated to the United States, that's going to be with the state itself or with more local government um, or organizations for the people. So those are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Again, we call those the Bill of Rights, and they're very, very important. You'll see this all the time, television, movies. Hopefully you don't ever get in trouble with the law, but we all have kind of those weird in-laws. Maybe they do, right? And so you know now where those rights are built upon. And again, we're going to talk about these. We're going to come back and be referring to these with different court cases and things that we'll be taking a look at going forward.